My non-biblical reading for this morning is from Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. This is a section on Jesus' birth. The birth of Jesus is presented, especially by Luke, as decisive, energizing toward a new social reality. Don't you love that? Decisive, energizing toward a new social reality. The early church obviously struggled with how to begin its tale of Jesus. The beginning must be just right, for there's something new here that can scarcely be articulated, and the articulation must match the reality of the newness. The birth itself is presented by the song of the angels against the rulers of the day. The rulers had decreed a census. The grim holding action of census was penetrated by the unscheduled and unextrapolated song of angels who sing a new song for a new king. The beginning is with a song that stands in conflict with the decree. All the old history is by decree, but the new history begins another way. The birth of a new king, the one Rome did not anticipate and Herod could not stop, begins another history, which carries in it the end of all old royal histories. Characteristically, the birth of this new king marks a jubilee from old debts, an amnesty from old crimes, and a beginning again in a movement of freedom.
The scripture reading this morning is from the book of Luke, chapter 1, verses 39 to 55. Within a few days, Mary set out and hurried to the hill country, to a town of Judah, where she entered Zechariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. As soon as Elizabeth heard Mary's greetings, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why am I so favored that the mother of the Messiah should come to me? The moment your greeting reached my ears, the child in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who believed that what our God said to her would be accomplished." Mary said, "My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you, my Savior. For you have looked with favor upon your lowly servant. And from this day forward, all generations will call me blessed. For you, the Almighty, have done great things for me, and holy is your name. Your mercy reaches from age to age for those who fear you. You have shown strength with your arm. You have scattered the proud in their conceit. You have disposed the mighty from their thrones and raised the lowly to high places. You have filled the hungry with good things, while you have sent the rich away empty. You have come to the aid of Israel, your servant, mindful of your mercy, the promise you made to our ancestors, to Sarah and Abraham, and their descendants forever."
Would you pray with me? Eternal One, fill us with such hope and such insight as we hear in Mary's song. Let us be lifted and filled, energized for a new social reality. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So the earliest Christian writings that we have are Paul's writings, written about 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death, with no mention of the birth of Jesus. The earliest gospel we have is the Gospel of Mark, which was written probably 30 or so years after the death of Jesus. And again, no mention of the birth of Jesus. So the first stories that we still have in our possession of his birth are in Matthew and Luke. both written 50 to 60 years after his death. That's a long time in there, and a lot of things that were written without this amazing birth story. And so we have to wonder, if you were one of the early writers, and there was this amazing story of Jesus' birth, would you not have written about it? Scholars pretty much conclude that the reason it wasn't in those earliest writings is because it was still being formed and developed. And it wasn't really of import until we hit Matthew and Luke. And so we have to ask ourselves, as we read this story, what was going through Luke's head at the time that it was written? As a preacher, right, Glenn, we know that there's a message we want to convey by what we say. Luke had a message he wanted to get across that would be meaningful and appropriate and helpful for the people of his time. And I think what Walter Brueggemann says is wonderful. This was an energizing, the story that Luke puts forth is an energizing for a new social reality, a decisive energizing. And so he starts with this birth story, and it behooves us to look at what was going on at the time that it was written so that we kind of understand perhaps why it might have been written and why the characters and why the things that are said. So let's go back to the time that Luke was written. Like I said, it was probably 50, 60 years after Jesus' death, so this puts us after there was a major war between Rome and the Jews, where Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed and has not been rebuilt to this day, and thousands upon thousands of Jews were killed in that war. Following all of that, there's a conflict, great conflict between the Christian Jews and the non-Christian Jews, all of whom were still worshiping together in the synagogue. But with the loss of so many Jews, and with a great influx of Gentiles who weren't circumcised, who didn't follow food and purity laws, the traditional Jews are a little bit more worried about maintaining their identity. So this becomes a time that's referred to as the Jewish persecution of Christians. Not persecution in the sense of we're going to go kill everybody, but persecution in the sense of social ostracism, where anybody who considered themselves a Christian Jew was kicked out of the synagogues. We don't want that sect coming in here and, muddying the waters, so to speak. There was the group that wanted to maintain their pure Jewish heritage and identity. And so it was time for everybody else to move on. But it wasn't just leaving the synagogue, it was also, it also severed family ties, economic relationships. You didn't intermix in those days. We're not going to have a Jew marrying a Christian Jew. All of that happened about that time. Not to mention just the struggle to survive post-war and having lost so many, many, many people. So that's what's going on. Now, if you're the author, okay, and you've had your life changed by the reality that was Jesus. Now, you never met Jesus, but Jesus had a huge impact on the people that followed him when he was alive, and he's continued to transform lives over the years. And you want to somehow bring that transformation to people, because your life has been so deeply touched Your spiritual life has grown tremendously. How do you articulate that amazing reality when there are hardly words to just, can you describe your spiritual life to somebody? How hard is that? Much less to convey the depth and presence and intensity and wisdom of a man who's been dead for 60 years. And so you're thinking about how you're going to do this and what stories you're going to use to convey this. And you're not so much worried about fact, because this is the ancient world and you're not really worried about fact. You're worried about conveying a truth with a capital T that can't be contained in words. And you wanted to lift people up and give them hope because they've just been severed from their families, from their worshiping communities. Economically, their businesses might be failing because they've been cut off from their other connections. What words of hope do you have? So given all that, we look at how the story starts. Because the beginning of a story is always the hardest. I went to a writing class once, and they said, you know, that first line of any story is crucial in hooking the author. So now every time I read a book, I look at that first line to see, well, how did this one do it? The beginning is important. And the part that we didn't read is part of what Walter Brueggemann lifted up. We'll read it tomorrow, but you all remember the story that says that there's a census that's been decreed, right? And everybody's supposed to go back to their hometown for this census. Well, all of that's a really good story. Probably didn't really happen, and people wouldn't have been required to go back to their hometown to do it. But we ask why? Why is there a governmental decree at the beginning of our story? Well, what does it symbolize? What happens when you have a census? People get counted, but why? Why would the emperor want everybody counted? Money. I want to know how many people I can tax and how much money I can get from folks. I want to know how many Jews are out there and if they're going to become a threat. So we have that at the beginning of the story juxtaposed, and that's the old order, juxtaposed to the heavenly messengers, the angels, who are crying out that there is a new king. And the plot thickens, really? We've got the old king who wants our money, but we've got a new king, and this new king is coming to all of us who have been oppressed and downtrodden. And so we look at the characters in the story, in the birth narrative. The characters are not characters from the old order, they're the victims of the old order. I mean, we've got Mary, who's what, 12, 13, 14, a young, innocent, faithful young girl. How much power does she have? 0. Zippo, no power. We have Elizabeth, who's an old woman, a barren old woman. How much power does she have? None. And even her husband, who might have just a little bit more influence in the community, but he's married, he's old, first of all. And he's married to a barren woman, so he doesn't have any heirs, proteges. So how much power does he have? None. How about the shepherds? Angels appear to the shepherds. Shepherds were who? Well, like society's rejects. No power. And a baby, by nature, has nothing. Helpless, powerless. And yet, suddenly, we find that the downtrodden, the powerless in the old social order have center stage. And they've found hope. I mean, this is a sign. This is a way to start a story. And then we move into Mary's song, which is known to us as the Magnificat, which was probably really an early Christian hymn that was then merged into this story. And that song says to us that things are going to be different. It says the promises are being kept even when it seems like all of the promises are failing. It says that the impossible is possible with God. And that's just been set up. Well, the angel came to Mary and said, you've never been with a man, but you're going to have a child. The impossible has become possible. Elizabeth is barren, and she becomes pregnant. The impossible becomes possible. Her husband, Zechariah, doesn't believe the whole thing. And so he gets struck dumb, can't speak. How often does that happen? Not often enough. That's not what you said, is it? But no. Not often enough. But no, it doesn't happen. So the impossible is possible with God. And that song says the impossible is going to continue to be possible. The lowly will be lifted up. The lame will walk, see him, and the blind will see. And the deaf will hear. And the oppressed will be freed. And women will be equal and have power. And that's the hope that shines forth in that song. A new social order is coming to be. And what's required for that to happen? In that story, all that's required for that to happen is for one person to believe and to give her whole self to the birth of something new. But you know what? That song wasn't just a song for that generation. That song was a song for all time. Because sadly, things haven't changed a whole lot. And that call wasn't just a call for Mary to give birth to something new. Mary was a metaphor for all of us to be called to believe and to give our whole selves that something new can be born in us and in this world. God's Spirit is stirring in us. And hope wants to be born in us. And it requires lending our whole selves to that. But it begs the question, who do we listen to? Are we listening to the decrees? Or are we listening to the angels? What do we do with the unwanted and the downtrodden in our world? How do we treat them? And do we believe that the Spirit of God can actually stir in each of us to bring out the best in us, that we can do good things for the world? Do we believe that good can overcome evil, that the systems of oppression and power will someday come to an end, that war can end, and that the oppressed can be freed? Can we allow that to be born in us, a new energizing social reality? There's a story about a young woman named Reiko Kitahara, who was a young Christian woman. She was the daughter of a professor in Tokyo at the end of World War II. The war ended and she moved into one of the poorest areas of Tokyo, a shanty town, where really all of the houses were rubble. People lived in poverty. It was where the rag pickers lived, where the people every day they went out into Tokyo and they looked for rags and cloth or anything that they could take with them and reuse or sell. But she moved there. And she lived among the rag pickers. And she gathered up their children each morning as they went out into Tokyo to look for their rags. She gathered all the children and she became their teacher. But they called the place Ant Town. Every morning in Ant Town, when it was still dark and the rag pickers were heading out into Tokyo, Reiko would be there in the dark, blessing them and sending them off for a prosperous day, a good day. And then she would spend her day with the children and her day visiting the infirm and the old and the sick and tending to them gently. And when the rag pickers came home at night, she would be waiting for them in the dark again, welcoming them with a blessing. She was compassionate, she was kind, and she was loving, and the people cherished her and the smile that she always greeted them with. She was there a couple of years when unfortunately she contracted tuberculosis. But she wouldn't leave because this was her town and these were her people and this is where she wanted to die. But she lived in a shack like everybody else. And she had no medicine, and she had no blankets, and she had very little food. And the people who visited her were the people that she had visited. She died young and beloved and compassionate and cared for. And after she died, they found a notebook under her pillow. And they'd often seen her open up that notebook. When they opened it, looked at it, they found that there was one line written in it. And the one line said, "Aren't you going to smile right now? Aren't you going to smile right now?" It was her reminder to herself when she was sick and in pain and dying that people still needed to see joy. They needed to know that hope. They needed to feel her belief and her trust. They needed to see her smile. Reiko gave her life, her love, her smile to the downtrodden of the world to try and bring hope. She brought her belief and her whole self to try and birth something in that place. It doesn't necessarily take that drastic of an act for us to do the same thing. For us to birth simple hope and light in the world today. Let me read you a short poem I found called Eulogy by Robert Morneau. She changed the world, though orphaned early. And knowing the Depression's poverty, she became strong and independent, wise and compassionate. She changed the world, gave life to 5 children, loved her husband for 54 years, cherished her 16 grandchildren, put first things first. She changed the world, nursing people back to health, working and playing with gusto, embracing God's will with a lively faith. The world was changed by one woman who loved her husband, her family, her God. You see, it wasn't just up to Mary and Jesus to bring balance in the world. It's up to each one of us to bring that balance, to be that light, to smile even when it's hard to smile, to lift up the downtrodden, to say no to the old social orders that oppress and judge and harm, to be energized by the message and the light that Jesus brought, and to continue to energize this world, to bring forth a social order that is filled with love and compassion and hope.